This is one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in early American history. A story that unfolded in silence, inside a small Puritan settlement where fear spread faster than reason. Before we go deeper, I'm curious to know something. Where are you listening to this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because stories like this, they feel very different depending on when and where you hear them. It started with voices, not rumors, not whispers between neighbors. Voices. Voices that were heard, but never seen. Voices that spoke in the dark, when no one else was there. And in Salem, in 1692, that was enough. Enough to accuse, enough to arrest, enough to kill. Because once someone said they heard your voice, there was no way to prove you didn't. No evidence could save you, no argument could defend you. How do you deny something that doesn't exist? That's what made it so terrifying. The accusations didn't need logic. They didn't need proof. They only needed someone to believe them. And once that happened, the entire town began to change. Neighbors turned on each other, families broke apart, children accused adults. And the worst part? No one knew who would be next. More than 200 people were accused. 19 were executed. And all of it started with something no one could see. But here's the question that still haunts this story. What were those voices really? And why did so many people begin to hear them at the exact same time? Stay with me, because what happened in Salem was not just fear, it was something far more disturbing. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. This is not simply a story about superstition. It is not just a story about ignorance, or about a time that was very different from our own. If you stay with me, if you follow this story from its first moment all the way to its end, you will see something far more disturbing than witchcraft. You will see how fear, real, human, suffocating fear, can transform ordinary people into something they can never fully take back. You will see how a community can turn on itself, how institutions designed to protect the innocent can become instruments of persecution, and you will be left with a question that is not easy to answer. Could it happen again? Stay with me, because what happened in Salem was far darker than you have been told. Chapter 1. The world that made Salem possible. To understand what happened in Salem, you have to understand the world that made it possible. And that world was built almost entirely on fear. The Puritan settlers who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony had not come to the New World in search of freedom, at least not in the way we understand that word today. They had come to build something specific, something strict, a society governed not by the laws of men, but by the laws of God. And their God was a God of wrath. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it feels like to grow up in a community where you are taught, from the moment you can understand language, that you are surrounded by evil, that the devil is not a metaphor, he is not a theological abstraction, he is real. He walks among you. He whispers in the darkness. He is always waiting for the moment you let your guard down. That was the world these people lived in. Not a world of science and reason, where unexplained things are simply unexplained. A world where unexplained things had only one explanation. The devil had done it. Salem Village, and it is important to be precise here, because Salem Village and Salem Town were different places, was a small, struggling farming community. Perhaps 150 families, divided by old disputes over land boundaries, divided by jealousy, divided by resentment. There were families who had prospered while others had not. There were arguments about who should lead the local church that had been building for years. There was tension between the farmers of Salem village and the merchants of Salem town, who seemed to grow wealthier with every passing season, while the farmers struggled against harsh conditions. This matters, because the hysteria that would consume this community did not fall from the sky. It grew from the ground that was already there, from grievances that had been building over time. It only needed something to disturb the surface. And in the winter of 1691 into 1692, that disturbance came. The Reverend Samuel Parris had been the minister of Salem village for 3 years. He was not a popular man. He was rigid, demanding, and deeply concerned with authority and control. He had argued with his congregation over his salary, over property, and over respect. Many believed he was the wrong man for the position. He came to Salem village with 2 enslaved people, a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. Remember that name. She would become the first person accused. But before that, something else happened. In the parsonage of Reverend Parris, during that cold Massachusetts winter, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to behave in ways no one could explain. Chapter 2. The Girls in the Parsonage. No one who lived through what came next ever forgot how it began, not with violence, not with a declaration. It began with children, with small, frightened girls, with sounds in a minister's house late at night when the rest of the village was asleep. Betty Parris was 9 years old, a quiet child, obedient, raised in a deeply religious environment where belief came before understanding. Abigail Williams was 11, older, sharper, more aware of the adults around her. In early January of 1692, both girls began to have fits. At the time, that word meant something very different. Today, we think of medical conditions. In Salem, a fit was a sign, evidence that something supernatural was happening. A child who had been fine hours earlier would suddenly scream, collapse, twist, and speak in ways that did not sound like her own. How do you explain that, if the only framework you have is one built on fear of the unseen? You explain it the only way you know how. Something is doing this. The Reverend Parris called for a doctor. William Griggs examined the girls and found no physical cause, no fever, no illness, no injury. So he reached for the explanation his world had taught him. He said the girls were under the evil hand. Those 2 words changed everything. Even the girls were not sick. They were bewitched. And if they were bewitched, then someone had done it. Someone in Salem. The question was no longer what was happening to them. The question became, who was responsible? Soon, other girls began to show similar symptoms. Ann Putnam, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, Mary Warren. A growing group of young girls whose voices would soon carry enormous power. There is something deeply tragic about them. Whatever was happening to them, their fear was real. Their suffering was real. They were not born cruel. They were children in a world that gave them no way to understand what they were feeling. And the adults around them did not protect them. They gave them meaning. And that meaning turned into something far more dangerous. Chapter 3. The Symptoms that Defied Explanation. What exactly were these girls experiencing? That question has remained unresolved for more than 3 centuries, and it continues to unsettle anyone who looks closely at the events of Salem, because whatever was happening to these children, it was real to them. Their bodies reacted. Their voices changed. Their fear was not imagined in the way we might casually dismiss it today. It was lived, felt, and witnessed. They spoke of invisible forces touching them, harming them in ways no one else could see. They described being pinched, bitten, choked, as if something unseen had hands. Some claimed they saw figures moving in the darkness, figures they recognized, neighbors, familiar faces, appearing in forms that should not have existed. These figures, they said, approached them, pressed against them, tormented them. Their bodies would convulse without warning. They would collapse to the floor, twist in unnatural ways, lose control of their speech. Words would come out that did not seem like their own. At times, they claimed they were pulled from their beds in the middle of the night, dragged by something no one else could perceive. The adults who witnessed these episodes were not skeptical observers standing at a distance. They were deeply affected by what they saw. Ministers, judges, men who were considered educated and rational within their world watched these children and saw something they could not easily dismiss. What unfolded in front of them did not resemble performance. It resembled suffering. It resembled fear so intense that it took physical form. And that created a problem. Because when a community witnesses something it cannot explain, it must choose how to interpret it. It must decide what framework to use, what story to tell itself in order to make sense of what is happening. In Salem, there was only one framework available. Over time, historians and scientists have tried to reconstruct what might have caused these symptoms. One of the most frequently discussed theories is ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye grain in cold and damp conditions, the exact conditions present during that winter. When consumed, ergot can produce hallucinations, convulsions, sensations of burning or being pinched, and severe psychological disturbances. It is a compelling explanation, but it is not conclusive. Other researchers have suggested neurological conditions, infections, or forms of encephalitis that could produce similar symptoms. Still, others point to what is now called mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon in which physical symptoms spread through a group not through a biological cause, but through psychological and social transmission, through fear, through suggestion, through the powerful human tendency to mirror the experiences of those around us. And perhaps it was not a single cause at all. Perhaps one child became ill, genuinely ill, and others, witnessing that suffering within the rigid and fearful structure of their world, began to experience their own versions of it. Perhaps the mind, under pressure, found a way to express something it could not otherwise explain. But in the end, the specific cause mattered far less than the meaning assigned to it. Because the adults in Salem did not respond by saying, "We do not understand this," they did not step back, observe, and allow for uncertainty. They named it. They said, "This is witchcraft." And once that word was spoken, it changed the direction of everything that followed. It gave shape to fear. It turned confusion into certainty. And it created a path that, once taken, would be almost impossible to abandon. Chapter 4. The First Names Spoken. Once the idea of witchcraft had taken hold, the next step was inevitable. If the girls were suffering, then someone had to be responsible. If something was harming them, then that harm had to come from somewhere. And in a world where invisible forces were believed to act through human agents, the question was no longer abstract. It became personal. Who was doing this? The girls were asked to identify those responsible, at first gently, then with increasing urgency. Ministers prayed with them. Adults gathered around them. They were encouraged to describe what they saw, to give shape to the unseen, to name those who came to them in the night. And eventually, they did. The first names spoken were Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. The selection of these names was not random. Tituba was an enslaved woman brought from outside the community, someone who already existed at the margins of Salem's social structure. Sarah Good was a beggar, homeless, known for wandering from house to house asking for charity, often muttering under her breath when she was refused. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had distanced herself from church life and had lived in a way that defied social expectations. Each of them, in different ways, stood outside the norms of the community. Each of them was vulnerable. And that vulnerability made them ideal targets. Because accusations, especially in times of fear, rarely begin with the powerful. They begin with those who have the least ability to defend themselves, those whose voices carry the least weight, those who are already, in some quiet and unspoken way, considered different. Once their names were spoken, the machinery began to move. Sarah Good was brought before the magistrates in March of 1692. Imagine standing in that position, surrounded by authority, while children convulse and scream at your presence, pointing at you, exclaiming that your invisible self is harming them in that very moment. How do you defend yourself against something like that? How do you prove that something no one can see is not happening? There is no defense. That is the core of the horror. The accusation itself is constructed in such a way that it cannot be disproven. If you deny it, your denial is meaningless. If the girls react, that reaction is taken as confirmation. The system does not require evidence in the way we understand it. It requires alignment with belief. Tituba's response changed everything. She confessed, not because she was guilty, but because she understood the situation with a clarity that others did not. She saw what happened to those who denied the accusations. She saw the direction things were moving, and she made a decision. Confession, in that moment, it was not surrender. It was survival. But she did more than confess. She told a story. She described the devil. She spoke of encounters, of strange creatures, of gatherings with other witches. She described a hidden world operating beneath the surface of Salem. And in doing so, she gave the court exactly what it needed. She confirmed that the threat was real. She confirmed that it was organized. And most importantly, she confirmed that it was not limited to a single person. There were others, many others. And with that, the fear expanded. No longer contained to a few individuals, it spread outward, moving through the community, attaching itself to new names, new faces. What had begun as a localized event became something much larger, something that no one could control. Yenin chapter 5. When fear becomes a flood. There is a point in every collective crisis where the situation grows beyond the control of any single person or institution. Salem reached that point in the spring of 1692. Up until then, it might have been possible to stop what was happening. It might have been possible to question the accusations, to slow the process, to introduce doubt. But once the fear took hold at a community-wide level, it began to move on its own. It spread the way fire spreads through dry wood, quickly, unpredictably, jumping from one place to another, feeding on whatever it could find. More girls began to show symptoms, more accusations were made, and the nature of those accusations began to change. They were no longer limited to the vulnerable. They began to include people who, under normal circumstances, would have been considered beyond suspicion. Martha Corey was accused, a respected member of the church, a woman who had openly questioned the validity of the accusations. Her doubt became her vulnerability. Rebecca Nurse followed, 71 years old, deeply respected, known for her character and her contributions to the community. Her reputation offered no protection. And that is the moment when something shifts. Because when even the respected are no longer safe, the entire structure of the community begins to collapse. Trust disappears, certainty dissolves, and fear becomes the only stable element. People began to understand that safety was no longer tied to behavior, reputation, or truth. Safety became random, unpredictable. The safest action, in many cases, was to accuse before being accused, to align yourself with the process rather than stand against it. Old disputes found new expression, personal grievances resurfaced under the language of witchcraft. Long-standing tensions between families, neighbors, and factions within the community were suddenly given legitimacy through accusation. Power shifted. Those who had once held little influence now had a voice that could not be ignored. The testimonies of young girls carried more weight than the denials of respected adults. And with that shift, the balance of the entire community changed. Imagine living in that environment, waking up each day unsure if your name would be spoken, watching neighbors disappear, hearing accusations that could not be challenged, understanding that truth offered no protection. And some people fled when they could, but most could not. They had homes, land, families, responsibilities. They were tied to Salem. And so they remained inside something that was growing larger, more dangerous, and more unpredictable with each passing day, waiting, hoping, knowing that hope might not be enough. Chapter 6. The Court of Oyer and Terminer. In May of 1692, the situation had escalated to a point where formal structure was introduced. Governor William Phipps established a special court to handle the growing number of cases, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Its purpose was to hear and decide. In practice, it became something else entirely. The court was led by William Stoughton, a man of strong conviction and absolute belief in the existence of witchcraft. He did not approach the situation with uncertainty. He approached it with confidence, and that confidence shaped everything that followed. The court accepted what was known as spectral evidence, testimony based on experiences that could not be seen, tested, or verified. The afflicted would describe how the spirit of the accused had appeared to them, harmed them, attacked them. They would point to empty space and insist that the attack was happening in that moment. And the court accepted this, not as possibility, as fact. That decision changed the nature of the trials completely, because once invisible evidence is accepted as real, there is no longer any way to challenge it. You cannot argue against something that cannot be observed. You cannot defend yourself against something that leaves no trace. The accused stood in that courtroom without protection, stripped of the basic structures that would normally allow a person to defend themselves. The trials followed a pattern. The accused would enter the room. The girls would react immediately, collapsing, screaming, claiming they were being attacked. And the judges would respond with a question that revealed everything about the process. Why are you hurting these children? Not whether. Why? Guilt was assumed. The trial existed only to confirm it. Some of the accused maintained their innocence with remarkable clarity and consistency. They spoke calmly. They denied the accusations. They asked for reason. It made no difference. Nothing they said changed the outcome. Because by the time they entered the room, the system had already decided who they were. Chapter 7. The Gallows and the Point of No Return. By the time the court was fully established and operating at full capacity, something irreversible had already happened in Salem. The accusations were no longer isolated events, no longer confined to a handful of individuals whose social position made them easy targets. The process had gained momentum, and once that momentum reached a certain threshold, it began to sustain itself. The first execution marked the moment when everything changed. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged. She was not the most respected figure in the community, and that fact made her an easier first victim. She had a reputation that did not align with Puritan expectations. She dressed differently, behaved differently, and had been accused before. In a community already searching for confirmation of its fears, she fit the pattern they were looking for. She denied the accusations. She insisted she was innocent. She stood before the court and rejected the idea that she had made any pact with the devil. But innocence was no longer the deciding factor. She was convicted. She was taken to Gallows Hill, and she was executed. That moment did more than end a life. It validated the system. It proved, in the eyes of the community, that the process was real, that it had consequences, that it would be carried through to its conclusion. Once that line had been crossed, the possibility of stopping began to disappear. The executions continued. On July 19th, 5 more people were hanged. Among them was Rebecca Nurse, a woman whose reputation had once seemed untouchable. Now she was 71 years old, deeply respected, known for her character and her long life within the community. Her case revealed something deeply unsettling about the nature of the trials. A jury had initially found her not guilty. That decision should have ended the matter. Instead, it did not. The court rejected the outcome. The jury was sent back to reconsider, placed under pressure until they returned with a different verdict, a verdict that aligned with what the system expected: guilty. Rebecca Nurse maintained her innocence until the end. She stood firm, refusing to confess to something she had not done, and that refusal, within the logic of the trials, sealed her fate. She was executed. The meaning of that moment extended far beyond a single life. It demonstrated that the system was not simply flawed. It was predetermined. Evidence did not guide the outcome. The outcome shaped the interpretation of evidence. On August 19th, 5 more were executed, including George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. He had been accused of being the leader of the witches, the central figure in what the court believed to be an organized and expanding conspiracy. When he stood at the gallows, something unexpected happened. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. At the time, there was a widely held belief that witches could not recite the Lord's Prayer without making a mistake. It was considered impossible. His recitation, clear and without error, caused a visible reaction among those gathered to watch. For a moment, doubt entered the crowd. People began to question whether the man standing before them was truly what he had been accused of being. But doubt in Salem did not have the strength to overcome momentum. Authority stepped in. The explanation was given that even the devil could disguise himself, that appearances could deceive, that the system had already reached its conclusion. The execution proceeded, and with it, the brief moment of hesitation disappeared. On September 22nd, the final group execution took place. 8 people were hanged on the same day. By this point, the process had become routine in a way that is difficult to comprehend. Death had been normalized. The act of execution had become part of the structure of the crisis. 19 people in total were hanged. One man, however, died in a different way. Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. He refused to say whether he was guilty or not guilty. Under English law, this refusal allowed the court to apply a form of punishment designed to force a response. He was placed under heavy stones. The weight was increased gradually, pressing down on his body over the course of 2 days. Each time he was asked to enter a plea, he gave the same answer. More weight. He died without submitting to the court. His death became one of the most enduring symbols of resistance within the entire episode. By the end of the executions, the system had fully revealed its nature. It no longer required justification. It no longer required careful interpretation. It moved forward on its own logic, sustained by fear, belief, and the absence of effective opposition. Chapter 8. When the accusations reached the wrong people. For a while, the system held. It held because the people being accused were, in the eyes of the community, the kind of people it was easy to suspect. The enslaved, the poor, the socially isolated, the ones who already lived slightly outside the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Their accusations did not threaten the structure of Salem. In a strange way, they reinforced it. They made the fear feel justified. But systems like this depend on something fragile. They depend on staying contained. And Salem could not contain what it had created. As the summer of 1692 progressed, the accusations began to move in a different direction. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then with increasing confidence. They started to reach people who did not fit the original pattern, people who were not marginal, people who were not easy to dismiss, people who mattered. Martha Corey had already shown what happened when someone questioned the system. Her skepticism had not protected her. It had marked her. It had turned her into a target. But even that could still be explained within the logic of the trials. Doubt could be interpreted as guilt. Resistance could be interpreted as concealment. What could not be explained so easily was what came next. Names began to appear that forced the community to pause, even if only briefly. Respected landowners, church members with strong reputations, individuals whose lives, up until that point, had been defined by conformity, by obedience, by visible faith. And still, they were accused. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. Because when the system begins to accuse those who embody its own values, something begins to fracture beneath the surface. At first, that fracture did not stop anything. The machinery continued to move. Arrests continued. Examinations continued. The girls continued to testify, their voices carrying the same weight as before. But beneath that surface, something had changed. People began to notice, not publicly, not loudly, but internally. A quiet discomfort began to take hold. Because if someone like Rebecca Nurse could be accused, if someone whose life had been lived in full view of the community, whose character had been known for decades, could suddenly be transformed into something monstrous by nothing more than accusation, then what did that say about everyone else? Or if she was not safe, then no one was. That realization did not immediately produce resistance. It produced something else first: silence, a more careful kind of silence. People began to speak less openly. Conversations shifted behind closed doors. Expressions of doubt became quieter, more controlled, shared only with those who could be trusted, because by that point it was already clear what happened to those who spoke too openly. Doubt was not neutral. Doubt was dangerous. And yet, even in that silence, the shift continued. Because the accusations did not stop, they expanded, they reached further, and eventually they crossed a line that could not be ignored. Individuals connected to positions of authority began to be named, people whose influence extended beyond the village itself, people whose status placed them closer to the center of power in the colony. And that is the moment when the dynamic changes, because fear can be tolerated when it affects others. It becomes intolerable when it approaches you. When the possibility of accusation moves from abstract to personal, from distant to immediate, the perspective shifts. The same system that once felt necessary begins to feel unstable. The same accusations that once seemed convincing begin to feel uncertain. The same certainty that drove the process begins to weaken. And that is what began to happen in Salem. Not a sudden reversal, not an immediate rejection, but a gradual erosion of belief. People began to ask questions they had not allowed themselves to ask before. Quiet questions, careful questions. Questions that did not challenge the system directly, but circled around it, testing its edges. What if the girls were mistaken? What if something else was happening? What if the evidence was not as solid as it appeared? These questions did not stop the trials, but they changed the atmosphere. Because once doubt exists, even in its smallest form, it begins to grow. And the system that had once relied on certainty now had to operate in an environment where that certainty was no longer absolute. That change was subtle, but it was irreversible. The accusations had reached the wrong people, and once that happened, the end had already begun. Chapter 9. The moment doubt could no longer be ignored. There is a point in every collective crisis where the structure that sustains it begins to weaken from within, not because of a single dramatic event, and not because someone suddenly steps in to stop it, but because the logic holding it together starts to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Salem reached that point gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. And that is precisely what made it so dangerous, because from the outside, everything appeared to continue as normal. The trials moved forward, accusations were still being made, people were still being imprisoned, and the system maintained the same procedures that had defined it from the beginning. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had begun to shift. The certainty that once drove every decision forward was no longer absolute. It still existed, but it was no longer stable, and that instability created space for something that had previously been pushed aside to begin taking form. That something was doubt, and once doubt enters a system built entirely on belief, it does not remain contained. It spreads, slowly at first, but with a persistence that cannot be reversed. This shift did not begin with the general population. It began among individuals who were close enough to the process to understand how it worked, but distant enough to observe its weaknesses. Ministers, writers, and educated members of the broader community started to examine the trials more carefully, not in open defiance, but through private reflection and controlled discussion. They began to question the methods being used, particularly the reliance on spectral evidence, which had once been accepted without resistance. At first, that acceptance had seemed natural within the framework of Salem's beliefs. If the devil could act through unseen means, then it followed that harm could be inflicted in ways that could not be directly observed. But over time, the implications of that belief became harder to ignore. If invisible actions could be used as proof of guilt, then there was no boundary to accusation. There was no requirement for verification, no standard that could be consistently applied, and no mechanism that could protect the innocent. That realization did not immediately stop the trials, but it changed how they were perceived. What had once felt certain began to feel unstable. And once that perception takes hold, it cannot easily be undone. People began to recognize that the system they had trusted was operating without limits, and that recognition created a tension that continued to grow. At the same time, another weakness began to emerge through the pattern of confessions. Earlier in the process, confession had been treated as validation, as confirmation that the threat was real and widespread. But as more cases accumulated, it became increasingly clear that confession was not necessarily connected to truth. It was connected to survival. Individuals who confessed were often spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence faced harsher consequences. This created a powerful incentive structure that distorted the meaning of confession itself. As this pattern became more visible, its implications became unavoidable. If people were confessing to avoid death, then those confessions could not be taken at face value. They were responses to pressure, shaped by fear rather than by factual admission. And if that was the case, then the reliability of the entire system came into question. This realization introduced a second layer of doubt, one that directly challenged the outcomes of the trials. If confessions were unreliable, and if spectral evidence could not be verified, then what remained to support the decisions being made? What foundation existed beneath the judgments that had already been carried out? There was no clear answer. And that lack of clarity began to spread through the community, not as open resistance, but as a quiet shift in perception. Conversations became more cautious. Certainty became less absolute. People who had once accepted the process without question began to reconsider, even if only privately, whether what was happening could truly be justified. At the same time, the scale of the crisis continued to expand. The number of accused individuals grew beyond what the system could effectively manage. Prisons became overcrowded. Families were affected across multiple layers of the community. What had once seemed like a targeted response to a specific threat now appeared increasingly indiscriminate. This expansion created additional pressure on the structure of authority. Because authority depends not only on power, but on the perception of control. Once a system appears to be operating beyond its intended scope, once it begins to produce outcomes that feel excessive or unpredictable, that perception begins to erode. In Salem, that erosion had already begun. External voices also started to play a role in this shift. Individuals outside the immediate environment of the village, including members of the colonial leadership and intellectual figures, began to examine the trials with greater scrutiny. They looked at the methods, the evidence, and the outcomes, and they began to identify inconsistencies that could not easily be reconciled with the standards of justice they expected. These were not emotional objections. They were structural, and that made them more difficult to dismiss. Because once the internal logic of a system is challenged from within its own framework, once its processes are shown to produce unstable or contradictory results, the system itself becomes vulnerable. By the late summer and early autumn of 1692, this vulnerability had become impossible to ignore. The trials continued, but they did so in an environment that was no longer defined by complete certainty. Doubt had entered, and it was growing. Not fast enough to stop everything immediately, but steadily enough to ensure that the system could not sustain itself indefinitely. This was the turning point. Not a dramatic collapse, not a moment of sudden realization, but the beginning of a process that would lead, inevitably, to the end. Because once doubt becomes part of the structure, the outcome is no longer a question of if, but of when. Chapter 10. When the system could no longer sustain itself, by the time the change became visible, the damage had already been done, and that is what makes this stage of the story so difficult to process. The executions had taken place, the accusations had spread across the entire community, and the structure that once held Salem together had already been deeply fractured. And yet, despite everything that had happened, and the system that created those outcomes did not stop immediately, it continued, at least for a time, moving forward with the same procedures, the same logic, the same outward appearance of certainty. But something inside it had begun to weaken. The system no longer carried the same conviction it once did. It still operated, but it did so with less stability, with less confidence, and with a growing sense that something was no longer aligned. This is how systems like this begin to fail. Not through a sudden collapse, but through a gradual loss of internal coherence. The logic that once made everything seem clear begins to break apart, and once that happens, every decision becomes harder to justify. In Salem, that shift emerged slowly. It did not come from a single voice or a single moment of resistance. It came from accumulation. Small doubts that had been ignored or suppressed began to surface in different places at the same time. Ministers started to question the reliability of the evidence, particularly the use of spectral testimony. They began to recognize that something which could not be seen, tested, or verified could not serve as a stable foundation for decisions of life and death. This realization did not immediately change the system, but it introduced a fracture that could not be repaired. At the same time, the confessions that had once reinforced the structure of the trials began to lose their strength. Earlier in the process, confession had been treated as confirmation, as proof that the threat was real and widespread. But over time, it became clear that confession was not necessarily connected to truth. It was connected to survival. People confessed because the alternative was execution, and once that pattern became visible, the meaning of confession changed. It could no longer be trusted in the same way. As more people began to understand this, the system faced a problem it could not resolve. If confessions were unreliable, and if the primary form of evidence was being questioned, then what remained? What was left to justify the process? The answer was unclear, and that uncertainty began to spread, not openly, not immediately, but in ways that mattered. Conversations shifted. The tone of discussions changed. What had once been stated with certainty began to be expressed with hesitation. Authority figures who had previously supported the trials without question now found themselves reconsidering their position, not always publicly, but internally. At the same time, the scale of what had happened could no longer be ignored. Too many people had been accused. Too many had been imprisoned. Too many had been executed. The system, which had once appeared precise and necessary, now appeared excessive and uncontrolled. It no longer felt like a response to a specific threat. It felt like something that had expanded beyond its original purpose. And that perception mattered, because authority depends on the belief that it is acting within reasonable limits. Once that belief begins to erode, the authority itself begins to weaken. In Salem, that erosion had already begun, and it was accelerating. Pressure also began to come from outside the immediate structure of the trials. Individuals who were not directly involved in the daily proceedings, but who had influence within the colony, I started to question what was happening. They examined the methods being used, the evidence being accepted, and the outcomes being produced, and they began to see inconsistencies that could not be ignored. These were not emotional reactions, they were analytical ones, and that made them more difficult to dismiss, because once the process is questioned on its own terms, it becomes much harder to defend. By the time Governor William Phipps intervened, the system was already in a state of decline. His decision to dissolve the court of Oyer and Terminer did not create the collapse. It acknowledged it. It formalized what had already begun. The court was ended. A new one was established, operating under different standards, with stricter limitations on the types of evidence that could be used. And almost immediately, the outcomes changed. Though cases that would have previously resulted in conviction now ended in acquittal. Individuals who had been imprisoned for months were released. At the same system, when adjusted even slightly, produced completely different results. That contrast revealed something undeniable. The previous outcomes had not been inevitable. They had been constructed. By May of 1693, the last of the accused had been freed. The trials were over. But what remained was not resolution. It was realization. A realization that what had happened was not the result of a single mistake or a single decision, but the product of a system that had been allowed to operate without limits, without sufficient scrutiny, and without the presence of doubt. And once that realization begins, it does not disappear. It stays. Because it raises a question that cannot be easily answered, not about what happened, but about how it was allowed to happen at all. Chapter 11. The Cost That Could Not Be Undone. When the trials finally came to an end, what remained was not relief in the way one might expect, but something far more complex and far more difficult to process. The machinery had stopped, the court had been dissolved, and the accusations had lost their power. But none of that reversed what had already happened. The consequences of those months did not disappear. When the system collapsed, they remained embedded in the lives of those who had survived and in the absence of those who had not. 19 people had been executed. One man had been pressed to death. Several others had died in prison before they were ever given the chance to stand trial. These were not abstract numbers. They were individuals whose lives had been fully integrated into the community before everything changed. They had families, responsibilities, histories that extended far beyond the accusations that ultimately defined their final months. The impact of their deaths extended outward in ways that could not be easily measured. Families were left without parents, without partners, without the stability that had once defined their lives. Children grew up in the absence of those who had been taken from them, carrying with them not only loss, but the knowledge of how that loss had occurred. The economic consequences were equally severe. Property had been seized, neglected, or redistributed during the period of imprisonment. You're leaving many survivors in positions of financial instability that could not be easily corrected. But beyond the physical and economic damage, there was something less visible and far more difficult to repair. Trust had been broken at a fundamental level. Neighbors had accused neighbors. Individuals had testified against people they had known for years, sometimes decades. Relationships that had once been stable were fractured in ways that could not simply be restored by the end of the trials. The community had not been divided by an external force. It had divided itself, and that kind of division does not disappear when the immediate crisis ends. In the aftermath, people were left to confront what had happened, and that confrontation did not produce a single, unified response. And some individuals recognized the extent of the damage and acknowledged their role in it. Apologies were made, statements of regret were recorded, and in certain cases, efforts were made to repair what could still be repaired. These actions, however, existed alongside another reality. Not everyone saw it the same way. Some continued to believe that the trials had been justified, that the threat had been real, and that the actions taken, even if imperfect, had been necessary. This divergence in interpretation created an additional layer of complexity in the aftermath, because it meant that the community was not only dealing with the consequences of what had happened, but also with conflicting understandings of its meaning. This tension extended beyond individual perspectives and became part of the broader legacy of Salem. The question was no longer only what had happened, but how it should be understood. Was it a mistake? A failure of judgment? A product of fear that had gone too far? Or was it something that, within the context of its time, could be explained and perhaps even justified? These were not questions with simple answers, and that lack of clarity ensured that the impact of the trials would continue long after the events themselves had ended. For those who had been directly affected, the consequences were immediate and personal. For the community as a whole, the consequences were more gradual, unfolding over time as the reality of what had occurred became more difficult to ignore. The absence of those who had been executed remained a constant reminder, not only of loss, but of the process that had led to that loss. The system had ended, but its effects had not. They persisted in memory, in relationships, in the altered structure of the community, and in the questions that continued to emerge as people attempted to understand how something of this magnitude could have taken place within a society that, only months earlier, had functioned in a completely different way. And perhaps most significantly, those effects extended beyond Salem itself, because what had happened there was not entirely unique in its structure. It revealed something about how communities behave under pressure, how fear can reshape perception, and how systems built on belief can produce outcomes that those within them may not fully recognize until it is too late. That realization is part of the cost as well, because once it is understood, it cannot be forgotten. Chapter 12. The Shadow That Remained. Even after the trials had ended and the last prisoners had been released, Salem did not return to what it had been before. The structure of daily life resumed, farms were worked again, churches filled, and the visible rhythms of the community re-established themselves. But beneath that surface, something had changed in a way that could not be undone. The events of 1692 did not exist as a closed chapter for those who had lived through them. They remained present, not as an immediate crisis, but as a lasting condition that shaped how people understood each other and the world around them. For years, and then for decades, the memory of what had happened lingered in ways that were both direct and indirect. Some families carried the loss openly, marked by the absence of those who had been executed or imprisoned. Others carried it more quietly, through the knowledge that they had participated in something they did not fully understand at the time. The community as a whole had to exist with the reality that it had produced outcomes that could not be reversed and could not be fully explained away. One of the most striking aspects of this aftermath was how long it took for formal recognition of innocence to emerge. The individuals who had been accused were not immediately cleared in any official sense. Their names remained associated with the charges brought against them, and the process of undoing that association moved slowly, unevenly, and over the course of generations. This delay was not simply administrative. It reflected the deeper difficulty of confronting what had happened and fully accepting its implications. Because to formally acknowledge innocence is to also acknowledge error, and not just individual error, but systemic error. Over time, steps were taken, statements were issued. In some cases, legal measures were introduced to reverse the outcomes of the trials and to restore, as much as possible, the reputations of those who had been condemned. But these actions, while significant, could not alter the fact that the consequences had already been lived. The physical locations connected to the trials also became part of this long shadow. The places where the accused had been held, the areas where the examinations took place, and most notably, the site of the executions itself, remained as quiet reminders of what had occurred. These locations did not change in the way that the narrative did. They remained fixed, grounded in the physical reality of the events, even as interpretations shifted over time. In later years, efforts were made to identify and preserve these sites more precisely. Gallows Hill, long associated with the executions, was more accurately located at what is now known as Proctor's Ledge. The identification of this site was not merely historical. It represented an attempt to connect the abstract understanding of the trials with a concrete place, to anchor memory in something that could be seen and visited. People come to that place. They stand there, and they attempt to understand something that resists simple explanation. Not only what happened, but how it happened. How a community that functioned within a shared set of beliefs and values could move, in such a short period of time, into a state where those same beliefs produced outcomes that contradicted their original purpose. How systems designed to enforce order and moral structure could generate disorder and injustice when applied without restraint. How the boundary between certainty and assumption could disappear when fear, is allowed to define interpretation. These are not questions limited to Salem. They extend beyond it, and that is part of why the story has remained relevant. Because it does not exist only as a historical event. It exists as an example of a pattern that can emerge under specific conditions. But that is not confined to a single place or time. Epilogue, the question that does not disappear. There is a tendency, when looking at events like the Salem trials, to place them at a safe distance, to treat them as something that belongs entirely to the past, shaped by beliefs and circumstances that no longer apply, and therefore unlikely to repeat. This perspective provides a certain kind of comfort because it allows the events to be understood without requiring deeper reflection on their underlying causes. But that distance is not entirely accurate. The specific details of Salem are tied to its time, its religious framework, and its social structure. The language of witchcraft, the role of spectral evidence, and the particular dynamics of that community are not directly transferable to the present. However, the conditions that made those events possible are not unique to that moment in history. Fear of something that cannot be clearly defined, reliance on claims that cannot be easily verified, the influence of collective belief over individual judgment, the pressure to conform to a dominant narrative, the tendency to direct suspicion toward those who are already vulnerable, the reluctance to challenge a system once it has established authority. These elements are not historical artifacts. They are recurring features of human behavior, and that is what makes the story of Salem difficult to fully contain within the past. Because it is not only about what happened, it is about how it happened. And once that question is asked seriously, it does not remain confined to a single place or time. So the voices that drove the Salem trials were never visible. They existed only in the experiences of those who claimed to hear or see them, and yet they were powerful enough to shape decisions, to influence authority, and to determine outcomes with irreversible consequences. That dynamic, the ability of something intangible to produce tangible effects, is not limited to the 17th century. It is part of how perception works, part of how belief functions, part of how communities respond under pressure, and that leads back to the question that remains after everything else has been examined, explained, and contextualized. Not whether Salem happened, but whether the conditions that made it possible still exist. The answer is not simple, and it is not entirely comfortable, because while the form may change, yet the underlying patterns do not disappear. They adapt, they reappear, and they continue to shape how people interpret the world around them. That is the final weight of this story, not the executions alone, not the trials alone, but the recognition that what happened in Salem was not an isolated failure of the past. It was an expression of something that, under the right conditions, can emerge again. And that is why it continues to be remembered.